So, Jonathan, in the film, you indicate that during the Cold War, there were 65,000 nuclear warheads and to a reduction of less than 14,000 nuclear warheads today. So it sounds as if progress has been made. Jonathan, can you explain to us how this happened?
Absolutely. It happened because of what Mikhail Gorbachev said: trust is the currency of the realm, and trust has to be built. That process actually really begins with another Republican president, not President Reagan, but actually with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon called for the abolition of biological weapons and retired the United States arsenal of biological weapons, unilaterally challenging the rest of the world to join and bringing about the Biological Weapons Convention, banning that weapon of mass destruction. Richard Nixon also was the president when the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was brought into effect in 1970. That treaty has three pillars. One pillar is every country in the world, except for 4 countries in the world, are parties to that treaty. Israel, Pakistan, India, and North Korea are not parties to the treaty. Every other country is. And only 5 countries out of all the rest of the countries in the world are allowed to have nuclear weapons under that treaty: the United States, China, France, the United Kingdom, and Russia. But the treaty contains within it a bargain. It is that those 5 countries agreed that they would negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons, disarmament. That commitment was made in the Nixon administration. And the rest of the world was promised the right to develop nuclear energy. Whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, that's not the question. The treaty gives countries the right to do that. Also, during the Nixon administration, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty came into being. That basically assured that the countries with the weapons would be vulnerable, that they wouldn't try to prevent themselves from being hit with nuclear weapons. Thus, it was called mutually assured destruction. So that process set in motion many civil society endeavors that were supported in a bipartisan process in the United States. I was very involved with a lawyers group, Lawyers Alliance for World Security, and we hosted lawyers from the then Soviet Union. We brought them to bankruptcy court and astonished them that the state would protect a debtor from the rapaciousness of our banks. We took them to see jury trials where they saw citizens engaged in the administration of justice. But what struck them the most was we took them to see judges that were holding the state to the rule of law. There was one judge, Norma Shapiro in Philadelphia, who was holding the city of Philadelphia in contempt of court for overcrowding in prisons. These lawyers from the Soviet Union said, "How can you do this? How do you hold the state to the rule of law?" She said, "Well, I'm the judge. It's cruel and unusual to overcrowd prisons, and I'm going to stop it." Those lawyers became the advocates of glasnost and perestroika. They were they were instrumental in helping change take place. There was another group, the Pugwash had conferences, was a group of scientists. They won the Nobel Prize for bringing groups of scientists together. So a fabric of trust was created. And thus there was a culture in our country that believed that we could make change. So when Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan decided that they would meet in 1985, there was a culture of people in this very conservative Republican administration. And we saw it, George Shultz, the Secretary of State. And what he did prior to the meeting in Geneva in 1985 was he met with Soviet leadership and he used the skills that he had as an American businessman and negotiated. And there's a meeting that he had with Shevardnadze at the United States mission to the UN just before the meeting in Geneva in 1985, in which they laid out a method of dealing with the differences, just like good businessmen negotiating an agreement that would work for both parties. They first began and said, what do we agree on? Let's build from things that we agree on. We agree that we want to protect our people. We agree that if there is a nuclear war, everything will be lost. Let's agree on that. And they built from there. Then they had a category of issues that they believed that if we negotiated further, we could make progress. So we'll have to deal with those. And then there were issues that they agreed that we're not ready to even deal with. So when Gorbachev and Reagan met in 1985 in Geneva, and I was privileged to be invited to be a participant in the 20th anniversary of that meeting that was hosted by the city of Geneva. So I spent a week with the participants in that meeting. They agreed in the second paragraph of their communique, a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. It was obvious. That is absolutely obvious. And I think that Rory's point about how many do we need? We now know that less than 200 of these thousands of weapons were to go off, it would basically throw at least 5 million tons of soot into the stratosphere and end civilization. And we know how close we've come to mistakes. I mean, look what happened here in Honolulu, just a few years ago. Somebody made a mistake, and everybody thought that North Korea was attacking you. Or so people realize mistakes can be made, and there have been dozens of mistakes by computers, and people have intervened. So the first thing they said was a nuclear war can't be won and must never be fought. And then the last line in that communique was, and neither party shall seek military advantage over the other. In other words, we persuaded the Soviet culture that we were not out to get them. And they started discussing amongst themselves, why are we making all these sacrifices? Why are we bankrupting ourselves with all of these weapons? How can we change? And once they started to question, the whole oppressive state made no sense. And thus the Cold War ended. So progress can be made. And what happened once that principle was laid in, after Reykjavik, there was a commitment that we would move toward a nuclear weapons-free world. And then the first treaty we had was the INF Treaty that completely wiped out an entire class of offensive weapons. And the Soviets honored it. And thus they stopped targeting Western Europe. And we honored it. Of course, the Trump administration pulled out of that treaty. I don't see any reason to have pulled out of it. We didn't get anything for pulling out of it. And the Russians retargeted Western Europe. But what was put in motion was cooperative threat reduction endeavors, in which we actually bought the material from decommissioned Russian nuclear weapons and used them in our nuclear energy plants. So we converted that which was a threat to us to light bulbs. And we went from over 65,000 to now less than 14,000. That is an accomplishment. That means that we are able to do this. We're able to wipe out huge amounts of these arsenals. But it was all built on trust, and it was all built on honesty, and it was all built on, as Einstein said, bullets kill men, but atomic bombs kill cities. A tank is a defense against a bullet, but there is no defense against a weapon that can destroy civilization. Our defense is law and order. As an American and as a lawyer, I am reminded of a key part of our Constitution. It's called the Supremacy Clause. It's unique. It says this principle in the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and it is. Any ratified treaty is the supreme law of the land. So when we violate treaties, we're not only violating international law, but we're violating the core of our country, which is the Constitution itself, the principle that when we make an agreement, we stick to it. And that's what we have to get back into action in our country. We have to hold every politician to the principles that build our country, that make our country great. There's a foundation, which is the rule of law. And treaties matter. And that's what allowed us to accomplish this great accomplishment of reducing the nuclear arsenals by over 80% and reducing the risk that we have. But today, trust has been broken and has to be rebuilt. And the rule of law is in danger as well. And it's up to us as Americans to get back on track.
So, Jonathan, how important is it, this aspect of trust that we have been talking about, and I think it's very important to raise again and again in diplomatic relations among leaders of these countries as instructive to us with respect to success or failure of their peace summits? And for example, peace has not been able to be achieved in the prolonged Ukraine-Russia conflict or between Israel and Hamas. So what are your comments about this?
Well, let's take Israel and Hamas first. There was a memo written in the 1990s called A Clean Break. It was written mainly by Douglas Feith and Richard Pearl. Richard Pearl was one of the people that stood in the way of moving toward nuclear disarmament at Reykjavik. And he wrote an essay called A Clean Break. And what was it a clean break from? It was a roadmap to break away from the Oslo Accords that had been achieved to ensure a two-state solution with the security of Israel and a legitimate state for the Palestinian people. So the policy of depriving the Palestinian people from security and dignity and a state of their own, which was part of the promise in the creation of Israel, and the Oslo Accords, which Israel fully supported, and most of the people in Israel supported that until the catastrophe we're living with today. There is no other choice. There's no other choice but moving toward the dignity of all people and the rule of law. The choices we have today in every one of our local conflicts are of a global nature, and they all rest on living up to bargains that have been made. The Oslo Accords were negotiated, and then there was a strategy to break them. And that's what we're seeing today. Same thing with the Ukraine. The Ukrainian nation had nuclear weapons, and they gave them up. They gave them up based on a promise by the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia to recognize their borders and their sovereignty. Russia violated that blatantly. But why did they do that? You have to listen to what they said. They said, we did that because we don't trust the United States anymore. We think you're going to put offensive weapons right on our border. That's what they believed. They believed that because of our invasion of Iraq. They believed that because of our expansion of NATO into other countries close to them. And they believed it because they stopped trusting us. And they acted out of fear. And they violated the most basic principle of the international order, to respect the borders and sovereignty of other nations. But worse than that, they put into play the idea that if we come to the defense of Ukraine fully, that they will then use nuclear weapons. So they've upped the ante of nuclear weapons and put the whole world at risk over this local problem. So when we talk about proliferation, we're talking about seeing a world in which every local border conflict becomes an existential threat to all of humanity if we have a cascade of proliferation. That's why the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is so important. And when we put at risk our promises to our own allies, Denmark, Canada, NATO allies, Canada, for goodness sake, Canada, where we share NORAD with them, you know, really? Or Denmark, where we have our security monitoring processes in Greenland, which is Denmark. We're stimulating proliferation, turning the crisis we see in Ukraine into a model that we'll see in other places. Hopefully people will look over, will look at the abyss, the danger of continuing this breakdown of the international order and start talking. Because if Humpty Dumpty falls apart, we can't put it back together again. We still have a United Nations where people talk. Last week I was participating in a conference of the Interparliamentary Union, which is a union of all the parliaments of the world except ours. And there were the speakers of all the parliaments, the people who put out the agenda of their parliaments, of all the countries in the world, including the Israelis and the Palestinians were there, including the Russians, including all of our NATO allies. Most of the delegations had about 5 or 6 people. The Chinese brought over 104 participants. So in the vacuum of American leadership, other countries will fill that vacuum. I don't really care about that. What I care about is the values that we stand for. Human rights, fundamental freedoms, freedom of conscience, freedom of assembly, freedom to worship as you want to, protection of private property, the rule of law. The state can't just come in and take your house. Truth in reporting the government to the people. The basic formula where the people are the employers and the state is the employee, not the state as the employer and all the rest of us are working for the state, and usually some leader of the state takes the attitude that everybody works for them. Those are the values that matter. I'm not afraid of the Chinese in the marketplace per se, but it's a values issue. It's a values issue, and our values matter because they're based on the inherent dignity of every single person and the rights of every single person, and that's what's at risk.
Jonathan, can you give us your assessment of the legal status worldwide of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, so we can gauge how near or far we are from achieving a nuclear weapons-free world? Because Gorbachev said that the refusal to engage in dialogue was the biggest mistake of the past few years. And he says above all else, national and all other interests, there are common interests and the prevention of nuclear war, and that we must move together towards a nuclear weapons-free world. So, Jonathan, give us that assessment. Very quickly, Jonathan. You only have 5 minutes to give the hope.
I'm trying to think about how I can make it as pithy and clear as possible. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty remains a pillar of international security. I would say it's the third most important legal instrument of the 20th century. The first international legal instrument is the UN Charter. It's a place where people can talk to each other. So when we deride the UN Charter, when we marginalize it, we marginalize the very structure that we need. Airplanes can fly from one country to another because of the UN Charter. Business, trade, the UN Convention on Arbitration is what allows financial flow all around the globe. You look at the clothes you're wearing, it may have been financed by a Swiss bank, produced in Malaysia with cotton from God knows where. We live in an integrated world. The climate is integrated, the economy is integrated, but our security attitude toward each other is totally provincial. It's not based on the reality that we have to cooperate to protect the climate. We have to viruses don't carry passports. The polar ice cap doesn't care what happens if we change the Gulf Stream and what happens to all of us. So we have interests that are collective, that are universal, that require cooperation. The UN Charter is the most important instrument to provide that architecture. The second is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says every single human being has inherent dignity worth protecting. This is an extraordinary accomplishment. And the third is stopping these weapons of mass destruction from spreading all over. The Cuban Missile Crisis, what precipitated this important treaty. The KGB and the CIA said, absent constraints, there'll be dozens of nuclear weapon states. So we risk a lot by not adhering to that treaty. And the disarmament provision in the treaty was affirmed by the International Court of Justice that said unanimously there is a duty to negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons. We don't see this duty put before us in the press. We don't talk about it. The City Council of New York passed a resolution to create a commission for education of the populace on nuclear weapons and in our schools. We need to teach people about this threat. It needs to be part of it was part of the dialogue that allowed Reagan to make that progress in the 1980s. People need to talk about it. So imagine if the Biological Weapons Convention said, no country can use polio or smallpox as a weapon. No country. But we'll let 9 countries use the plague as a weapon to maintain international peace and security. You would say, that's absurd. That's not sustainable. That can't work. It just offends our sense of fairness and logic. But that's precisely the regime we have with nuclear weapons. We're saying that 9 countries can have them, and we're not going to call on them to negotiate and make a safer world, and the rest of the world can't have them. That's not going to last very long. People don't like to be treated as second-class citizens. People don't like to feel that they can't rely on the most powerful to restrain themselves. So our choice is either a dystopian world in which every conflict puts the whole world at risk, or getting back on track to the values that make our country great, the rule of law, and what makes our business community great. Because I've done business in lots of countries around the world as an international lawyer. Lots of places you make an agreement, it's not very stable. It's transactional and it's always in negotiations. In this country, for the most part, when 2 people shake hands and say we're in agreement, you can trust them. That's the norm. And that's the kind of leadership we need. Leadership that just basically, it's not partisan, it's just integrity. And that's for all of us to live up to and to force our political leaders to do the same.
A few years ago, those of us who live here in Hawaii received a false missile alert, as Jonathan mentioned, through the state's alert system. False or not, it was very concerning and alarming. Realistically, what can or should we do in the event of an imminent attack?
So, Jonathan, I'll have you answer that, please.
The International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War won the Nobel Peace Prize. It's an organization of doctors with expertise in the subject, as well as the Pugwash conferences, which is scientists. And one of the hats that I wear is I'm the senior advisor to and the representative to the United Nations of the Summit of the Nobel Peace Prize winners. And to a one, they all agree, you can't do anything. And so a few years ago, when there was the ballistic missile threat here in Hawaii, the U.S. Pacific Command, this is what was put on the televisions here, right? Social media said, ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii, seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. Right? And then the U.S. Pacific Command was all over the television, said, The U.S. Pacific Command has detected a missile threat to Hawaii. A missile may impact on land or sea within minutes. Within minutes, this is not a drill. If you're indoors, stay indoors. If you're outdoors, seek immediate shelter in a building. Remain indoors, well away from windows. If you are driving, pull safely to the side of the road and seek shelter in a building or lay on the floor. We will announce when the threat has ended. This is not a drill. Take immediate action measures. Well, let me explain that with then less than 1,000th of a second, the heat of a nuclear bomb will be 3 times the heat on the face of the sun. Within 100 miles, there'll be winds of 600 miles per hour. A fireball will be created that will basically evaporate everything in that range. Closer to the epicenter, the bomb in Hiroshima was about, the highest estimate is 15 kilotons, 15,000 tons of TNT. We have bombs in the megaton range, 1 million tons of TNT. We're talking about immeasurable suffering, immeasurable destruction. There is no defense. There is no place that you could hide in. And you know what? I was in Hiroshima for a gathering, and I met a man who runs a Buddhist temple now, and he was 8 years old when it happened, and he and some of his friends had gone into a tunnel in the morning of August 6, 1945, to play, like kids do when they're 8, 9 years old, and they came out in the afternoon. Everything they knew, everyone they knew, was gone. Gone. And he was just eaten by anger and resentment for many years. And he said when he was about 16, it hit him. He could just have this anger eat up the rest of his life, or cultivate compassion and forgiveness. And he decided to do that. And he's become a very noble person. And he set up a Buddhist temple to focus on the power of compassion and forgiveness. We all ought to ask for forgiveness. To build these arsenals with our taxes, to threaten people all over the world. I don't believe that this venture with nuclear weapons is morally acceptable. The idea of putting future generations at risk like this. That's why the term abolition was used by Mikhail Gorbachev, the same term that we did with slavery. Slavery was immoral. It couldn't be made moral by improving the condition of slaves, by improving their diet, improving their education. The enterprise was immoral, and nuclear weapons were immoral. And Ronald Reagan understood that clearly. That's why he was willing to make the change that he made and helped end the Cold War. Maybe his politics were very right-wing and conservative, but at heart he was a reasonable human being who had an optimistic attitude. The only possible protection we have against nuclear weapons is getting rid of them.
What do I do as an individual when I'm trying to inculcate in my children and grandchildren values and morals where they cannot see it reflected by our institutions?
I don't know you, so it would be presumptuous of me to tell you what to do. But there are general principles here, and I'll just take 2 of them. First of all, we heard from some political leaders here. Your senator and your governor. You don't need to lobby them. I think they need to be wind in their sails. And how you influence political characters is you organize, you don't mourn, you organize, and you come with groups of people with your policy suggestions and engage with them. So I think it's real important that when you have political leadership like this, to push them to take the next step, to tell them that, to let them know that your group is going to be behind them, and the next thing is educate people. The ideas that you've expressed, your concerns, spread them, find ways of spreading them. And I want to just stop right now and thank Audrey Kitagawa for convening us today. Because it's exactly this kind of process that has to take place all across our country and across the world, where people get together and feel safe to speak frankly, to feel safe that we can talk with each other. You know, that's like, Rorry keeps coming back to fear versus a sense of confidence and safety. Are we the land of the free, the home of the brave, or not? Really, the song ends with a question. Oh, say, will this flag be standing? Will we prevail in this turbulent time and be brave and free? So I think deeply about this question, and I think deeply about how the circumstances of the moment affect me personally. And I've come to this conclusion. My spiritual state, my state of being, should not be contingent on political vicissitudes of the world. Because what makes me human, the values that come from within, don't come from the information of the world. Love comes from the light of the soul. Forgiveness never comes from what happens to you in the world. The world gives you lots of reasons to be pissed off. But forgiveness comes from something deep inside. Compassion that you'll feel the suffering of others, does that come from the world? No, that comes from something deep in the heart, deep in the soul. So these things that are so important to us, they are not contingent on the political circumstances. They're contingent on something deep within us. So we've got to, all of us, dig deep and say, do I really believe in the love of power or the power of love? Jesus' message, the power of love. Do I really believe in the power of ideas? We hold these truths to be self-evident. That was an ought, not an is, when it was stated. It was a vision, and it's the vision of our country. It's the vision. When it was stated, it didn't include white men without property. It didn't include women at all. It didn't include people of color or indigenous people. But the seed was there. The seed of truth was there. So it's those perennial truths of the centrality of compassion the Buddha taught, the centrality of love that Jesus taught. These truths are what I think we have to cling to and organize ourselves around. And that's not new. That's always been there. We're not the first group of people to face turbulent times. It's our job, however, to reaffirm those highest values that have always been part of humanity.
So thank you, Jonathan. We shall consider that to be your conclusory remarks.
So my conclusory remark is what Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell and Robert Oppenheimer, the three of them created the World Academy of Art and Science. They wrote a manifesto, and they said, what's before you is death or flourishing, and it depends on this. Remember your humanity and forget the rest.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan.